Hello, and welcome to this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by Motors and Cazoo, with Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters.
Hello and welcome to this, the first of our new monthly podcast episodes looking at the performance of trade values with Brego. At the end of each month, we'll be joined by Rupert Pontin, Head of Insight and Communication at Brego, who will take us through the key trends impacting used car values. Brego was founded in 2019 to improve the accuracy of current and future residual values and develop high-quality, reliable solutions for its customers in the dealer, OEM, and finance sectors. Using a unique valuation and forecast methodology, Brego prides itself on providing world-class retail-driven pricing insight from the widest available market data set in the UK. To achieve this, it collects up to 1 million retail prices daily and uses a historical database with over 2.2 billion data points. Three of the key themes for this episode, and indeed over the coming months, will be pre-registrations, Chinese OEMs, and EV values and forecasts. So welcome to the Motor Trade Radio podcast, Rupert. That's quite an impressive data set you guys at Brego have. It looks as though we're going to have plenty to talk about.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Curtis. It's great to be here. Yeah, we've got an amazing set of data, really, that has been building over the last 7 or so years, and very, very comprehensive. And I think the sort of neural network valuation methodology we use is unique. And it took years to train the model to be able to be as accurate as it is. But once you train that model to a very high degree of accuracy, it can actually function using very, very small volumes of data, which is why we are able to be so accurate in the sort of supercar sectors where there's very, very little data around, as well as obviously being accurate where you have more data as well. But yeah, it's a really, really good bit of kit. And Simon and Philip Hunt, who are the co-founders, did a really, really good job of developing that.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Philip and I have been really looking forward to this.
Yeah, no, welcome, Rupert, and I think with this, knowing you personally, that having all that data at your fingertips and giving you that insight, it's going to be some fantastic conversations with you over the months. So, I mean, a huge warm welcome, Rupert, and I for one looking to hear your take on the current trade value and how they're performing. So, let's get things underway. And can you tell us a little bit more about Brego's approach to trade values? I mean, you just touched it on a little bit there in terms of that methodology. Have you got anything else you can share with the audience?
Yeah, I think so. I think we are very much a retail-driven product. We, as Curtis pointed out, we look at a huge volume of retail data. We also do take some data from our customers, and those could be customers in the lending space or customers in the dealer space, and they give us an element of visibility on what happens within the trade market. But we create a trade price driven back from the retail price because, these days, many dealers and people that operate in the automotive sector acknowledge that retail back is the way in which it is best to operate their businesses. But getting that trade figure right is very, very important. And by virtue of the fact that we have this neural network that requires sort of very limited volumes of data, once we've got it right, if you see what I mean, we're very confident with the accuracy on the trade values. It's I think that's probably the best way to describe it. So it is retail driven, but very important to get those trade figures right.
And I mean, we talk about the audience of your customers and where you operate, but obviously one of the big markets for you is the dealerships, the retail dealers in the UK. And for the benefit of the listeners who run dealerships and dealer groups, you want to explain your Brego dealer platform is to them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the dealer platform was built because it's all very well coming up with some trade and retail values and having the accuracy there, but actually, it's the way in which one starts to use the data that's important. So, for the larger organisations, they can use our APIs, and that's absolutely fine. But actually, a lot of the value in the data for the large dealers, but also particularly the mid-sized and smaller dealers, is the ancillary information that comes along with the valuation. So, for each vehicle that somebody values, we not only give the current valuations, trade and retail, but we also give a future valuation curve on them. And we also give all sorts of supplementary information, such as previous advert listings, similar vehicles in market, a desirability aspect. So the platform was built to deliver that information to the dealer in an easy to use and constructive way. The other thing that is very good with it is that it allows dealers to be able to benchmark themselves against other dealers, either nationwide or local dealers, to be able to see what stock they've got, to be able to see what their stock turn is like. And it's a very, very comprehensive tool that enables them to help manage their business significantly well. And, all those bits and bobs for the larger dealer groups, are available via our API as well. So we offer a comprehensive feed across to the trade as a whole. We do actually have a secondary platform, which is a lender platform, which presents the data in a slightly different capacity, but again, more tailored for the lending space than for the dealer. We made sure the dealer platform had the KPIs in the right place to make life easy for them.
Now, Rupert, before we look at April's used market trends in detail, let's start with the typical benchmark for trade values, which is 3 years, 60,000 miles. But can you explain why you don't think that's necessarily reflective of real world usage and how that actually shapes the figures we'll be discussing?
Sure. I think we saw the significant change in the way in which we all live off the back of the pandemic. And one key part of that was the amount of time that people spend in a car, either traveling to meetings or traveling for social purposes. And that change in the way in which we travel has made a significant difference to the output and the type of vehicles that come back into the used car marketplace. So where we have that traditional 3 years, 60,000, I think that is still in part relevant into the fleet and contract hire and leasing sector, because that's what they've always worked with. But the reality is that when you look at the data on vehicles that are used today, we see a very different picture. So actually, at 3 years old, the average mileage in marketplace for a 3-year-old car is 28,247 in April. So that is a true reflection of the fact that people just don't travel in the same way that they did. And even from sub 1-year-old vehicle, the average is 4,635 this month. So a really different view of how much usage a vehicle has, and that naturally reflects itself in a different type of valuation and depreciation curve, where we find now that retail pricing sits higher, retail and trade pricing sits higher than it did a few years ago.
And just following on from that, Rupert, do you have a sort of typical average for those non-fleet, non-contract hire cars?
Well, and so yes, you're right to ask that question, Curtis, because that 28,247 does include fleet vehicles as well, because we're looking at a whole market. It's very difficult to identify for us to be able to look at the whole market retail information and say that was a fleet car and that was a private vehicle. But I think I would guide us back to the point that we're now in a situation where we have around 50% new sales to private customers and 50% to trade to business customers. That has changed a little bit since the pandemic. We were higher with retail registrations for a while, but the honest answer is I can't give you a direct answer to that question, because it's very difficult to identify those vehicles.
And I mean, Rupert, thinking about April now and what's been happening, we sort of, first month following the first quarter of the year, straight after the new plate month there. And drilling down a little bit specifically now in terms of what your data is showing you, and particularly if we think firstly, thinking about that the used car sales volumes, used cars by sector, and
Yeah.
the big one that everybody wants to talk about is by fuel type, particularly now with the Middle East conflict and the prices at the pumps. Do you want to talk through what your data's been showing you for the month of April for the listeners?
Yeah, you've cut straight to the chase there. You've gone right for the hot potato, which is the right thing to do under the circumstances. So, in terms of total sales for the month of April, and given this, we're looking at data that is, arguably we've got 2 more days worth of transactions to filter into it. We've seen quite a drop off in the number of sales. So, we've seen a decline of around 17% month on month. So we've seen quite a big drop there, which was a bit of a surprise in some respects. But if you start to think about the position economically and from a cost of living perspective, I think it's quite a scary place for the consumer at the moment. So perhaps we should be considering ourselves lucky to see a 17% drop. But that's certainly what we see in terms of sold volumes. When you look at the number of listings, advert listings that we see in the marketplace, we've seen a drop of 4.6% in terms of advert listings. So a very, very different picture. So there's more vehicles that are available for sale at the moment. Now, you asked me there specifically about what's happened in terms of sale data by fuel type. The key thing, I guess, was to identify what's going on with the non-fossil fuel vehicles, particularly battery electric vehicles. So in terms of the month-on-month change in sales, there was an increase of just over 1% in the volume of EVs that were sold, which is probably a little bit less than I expected. And when we look at hybrid saw an increase of 0.25%. But again, I am saying that there is a couple more days worth of data to come in here. But it's important to take an apples for apples comparison. So in total, battery electric vehicle sales were at 9.64% of the total sale volume for the month. Whereas hybrid were at 6.73, plug-in hybrid at 4%. So, an increase for sure, but perhaps less than we've seen in some of the press.
And I suppose on that, then, do you feel that the current climate, should we say, the economic and geopolitical climate, you think that's having more an influence on overall transactional activity rather than by fuel type?
I think it is. I think it absolutely is. I think that people are spooked at the moment. The last set of I'm just about to do the next set of economic indicators, but we've seen the rate of inflation slightly increase. I think that we're going to see that come up significantly more in coming months. We are at a position where, as we record, they haven't announced what the bank base rate is going to do, but they're expecting it to stay where it is. The consumer confidence has dipped. A litre of petrol is now £1.59p a litre. Go back 6 weeks before the start of the war, that was £1.34. So I think the consumer is seeing quite an increase in their cost of living, and I think it's just making them a little bit reticent to spend on big ticket items. Now, we also report and look at the leisure market as well, so holiday homes, touring caravans, motorhomes and campers, and we're seeing a similar sort of pattern there. What worries me perhaps for the rest of the economy is that, traditionally speaking, the auto sector and the leisure sector, they tend to be more resilient to circumstances like this. So if we're seeing this kind of drop in our marketplaces, I worry about what we might see in the rest of the economy. But it is a very, very delicate time, I think.
I mean, that's a key point that you've made there in terms of those different sectors. And I know for the listeners, as we sort of have these monthly catch-ups, that you do look at lots of different sectors, and it gives you a quite a unique view of the entire marketplace of what's moving and what's changing in different sectors.
Yes, it does. So we do. We also do motorcycles and LCVs, and in the background we work with other data sets relating to products that we don't actually produce as yet. But it certainly helps us to see a complete view of what goes on in the marketplace across different retail territories.
And Rupert, from your research for the month, can you take us through what trends you've seen in average sale price, days to sell, and also days to sell by fuel type?
Sure. Yes, I can. So, if we're talking about, we'll start with days to sale, just purely because that's to hand at the moment. So, days to sale overall for the month at 37.2, which is pretty much the same as it was the previous month. And I was a little bit surprised by that, given that we'd seen this, tail off in the number of sales. Where we look at it by fuel type, we've actually seen a drop of just about 1 day for battery electric vehicles, which puts them at 40.3 days to sale. Now, what is interesting is that over the last couple of months, the battery electric vehicles, the rate of sale has slowed slightly. So a few months ago, they were at the same level as, and in fact, for a couple of months, they were ahead of, they were selling quicker than the market as a whole, certainly petrol vehicles, but it's slowed down now. So the direct comparison there for petrol in April was 36.1 days and electric vehicles 40.3 days. So we've now got this gap that's opened up. And I think that is a reflection of the quantity of battery electric vehicles that are coming into the marketplace, and also there is a division here, which we can see by querying the data in more detail, where the older cars with the lower ranges are the ones that are sticking about, and they are having an impact on that overall days to sale.
Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? So those older generation ones are actually adding to the days to sell because they're taking so much longer proportionately.
They are. The only way to really shift them quickly is to start thinking about dropping the retail price significantly and just making them, forcing the issue and making them just too much good value for money for people to ignore. But we are seeing, the three of us are aware that when you look at what new product and what sort of pre-registered product, which is another thing we need to talk about, that's coming into the used car market now, we're seeing some consistently high ranges. I mean, the latest BMW iX3 with a range of over 500 miles, the recently announced Mercedes C-Class with 480 miles. As those come back to the marketplace, when you're looking at something that's got 120 to 200 miles, the only way that car finds a home is if you're dealing with it from a price perspective, and they will hang around, which is what's happening here.
Well, Rupert, thanks for setting the scene on how values have performed over the course of April. It's always a significant month, isn't it? Because it's hot on the heels of the March plate change and the churn created by the new plate. So some useful insights there on used car price trends and used car sales volumes across the dealer network. We'll be back with more of Brego's trade value trends from Rupert after the break.
You're listening to all the chatter that matters on this special weekday episode of Motor Trade Radio, powered by Motors and Cazoo.
Welcome back. And Rupert, as part of your monthly analysis and probably daily work that you're involved with, but you look at the retail advertised volumes, and can you explain why this metric is really important to those listening, and what trends you've identified throughout the month of April?
Yeah, sure, Philip. I think from our perspective, it is one of our primary sources of information, but it is also key to be able to highlight to customers and users of the product that we're looking at a whole market, not just an individual advertising platform or an individual source of data from an auction or something like that. So it's very important that we look at the total volume of vehicles that are out there in the marketplace. The other side of it, of course, is that in looking at that, you start to be able to drive some metrics around, for example, let's say April, on average, there were 862,904 cars advertised over the course of the month. And if you then look at the total sold in that period of 349,379, then you can start to build some metrics that say, okay, well, what percentage of that whole market was that? So sales for the month of April were 40.4% of the total number of vehicles advertised, whereas in the previous month, sales were 46.5%. So you'd be able to start to build some really interesting metrics that show you how the market is flowing, what the volume of stock is like in sales. The other important thing that we like to look at is to be able to see what the difference is between what the retail advertised price of that vehicle is overall and what the sale price of the vehicle is overall, which gives you an indication on how hard the dealers are having to work to sell the vehicles. Do you see what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
So, as a direct example on that, in December 2025, the change between the originally advertised price and the delisted price or sale price of the vehicle was 10.6% in December, whereas for this month it was 7.5%.
So the
And
discounting is softened.
yeah, they haven't needed to do it, and you know, you and I have been around the block a little bit, I have to say, and so we kind of know that there is a cycle to this, but it's really interesting to watch that cycle and actually see it play out. So for us, really important to be able to see both sides, the advertised side and the sold side, so we can start to drive some cool metrics around what goes on in the marketplace. And of course, those are invaluable to the dealer too, because we're looking at it at a high level here, but some of the tools you can use through the Brego platform allow you as a user to be able to query our data set and be incredibly specific, down to individual model and trim derivative, and ask the system to give you data on how that is performing by region, by price range, by age. So it's invaluable information to help our customers.
And talking about that, I mean, thinking going back to sort of April there, looking at that days to sell, across the board, but more specifically, and it's back to that fuel type question that we talked about earlier. Are you seeing any trends around, the days to sell throughout the month of April? You talked there about obviously that discounting side of things, but what about the days to sell? What trends are you seeing through April on that?
Well, generally speaking, in April, the days to sale have increased for most fuel types, is a simple answer. But only via a very, very small amount, because as I said to you, the overall figure for the market was 37.3 in March and 37.2 in April. But just slight nuances. Petrol took slightly less, diesel took slightly more, electric took very slightly less, but hybrid were pretty much the same, and plug-in hybrids were the same as well. So actually a fair degree of stability at this time of the year. I'm very worried about what will happen in May, though.
I mean, this is the question, isn't it? Where we still at this point that we're not, we haven't got long enough data sets to show any sort of significant changes in the market. That actually over time, that's when we might start to see that shift in performance.
Yeah, I mean, there is a pattern year on year where we can see, obviously in December and January, we were sort of mid 45, 46 days to sale. But then that drops quite quickly as we start to see the dealers that have cleared out of that of stock that sat there over the 2-week Christmas period. So if you run that through from January 26, where we were at 45.2, in February we were at 40.5, in March 37.3, and I would have expected under normal circumstances to have seen April drop perhaps down to 35, 34 days to sale overall. And that's where we've got this slight stumbling block. And, if you then look at what would happen in May, May last year, it had just stabilized at a similar sort of level as to where we are now. But, who knows we just don't know what's going to happen over the next few weeks.
And Rupert, your analysis also covers the month's best sellers, fastest sellers, and slowest sellers. Who were some of April's winners and losers? What stood out for you?
Well, we had, it's interesting. The best-selling cars in April, the top three, were a Tesla Model 3, a Tesla Model Y, and a Fiat 500 hatchback. And they were, in terms of volume, those were the top sellers. And in terms of market share, the Tesla Model 3 took an overall 0.3% market share. The Model Y was slightly behind at 0.26, and the Fiat 500 at 0.26. The Tesla Model Y was 0.27. So those were your best-selling cars. When you come to the fastest-selling cars, this is also interesting because we're back into slightly different. A lot of them are electric, to be fair. In that top 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Tesla had 5 models. They took first and second place with the Tesla Model Y rear-wheel drive at 19.5 days to sale, the Tesla Model Y long range at 22.7 days to sale, and then we had MG ZS at 25.1 days to sale. So it is interesting at the moment that the number of models, fastest selling models that are either hybrid or electric, which I find fascinating. If we're talking about the top 10 slowest cars, and this is for vehicles that sold in more with a volume of more than 10 units, because lots of cars can sell slowly at sort of 1 and 2 in sort of volumes of 1 and 2. But the slowest selling car was the Honda CR-V Estate 2-litre PHEV Advanced Tech. And that took an average 100.8 days to sell, with an average sale price of 36,727. Yeah, I was quite surprised by that, actually, if I'm honest with you.
The dealer that might be listening might not be.
Well, you could absolutely, those who have got those in stock. If I poke around in Brego Insight in the platform, I can identify who's got them.
So they're not a very good customer. They obviously need to become one, don't they?
Yeah, they do. I think for me in this list, there were a couple of surprises or maybe slight red flags for me, and that was that in that top 10 there are 2 Volvo EX30 models. Now, we quite often see month on month that the Volvo EX30 do fall into this slowest selling category, or they fall into the highest volume of pre-reg cars. Now, I think for me, it just says, what's going on with the EX30 here? Why are they struggling so much? But I thought I'd just highlight that as an oddity within the data as far as I was concerned.
That is interesting because it's still a relatively new car. So, I take your point on the pre-raters there.
So, I mean, Rupert, for me, fascinating. I'm really looking forward to, these future market reviews with you and the data that you've got access and at your fingertips. And as you say there, sharing some of the insight that's accessible, to those Brego users, whether in the lending space or the dealer space or whatever sector they operate within. And as you said right at the start there, whether they're dealing with cars, LCVs, or that leisure sector, you've got the data there to support and help their decisions. So I think for me, this first conversation with you is fascinating. So that data that you can have access to and drill down to, that gives you that informed decision for the users of the Brego Insight.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. There's an awful lot of data that we can drill into, particularly around the cars. And it can be absolutely key to dealers to be able to look at things on a very local basis, see what their local dealer, what their competitive dealers locally are selling things for and why, and it helps them to be able to build a pricing strategy and a stocking strategy, as well as just being able to just generally value vehicles. You know what I mean? It really is a huge added value rather than just a valuation tool.
But that's all for the first of our special monthly podcast episodes with Brego. Many thanks to Rupert for joining us. We'll catch up again this time next month to see how May performed. Thanks for listening. We really hope you found these insights useful. Philip and I are back with all the big car retailing headlines this weekend. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
Thank you for listening to this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by Motors and Cazoo. Philip and Curtis will be back with the week's big motor retailing headlines on Saturday.